Hello and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jimmy Lowe, and I'll be presenting my thesis, Dress for the Gender You Want, Clothing, Gender Identity, and Sexuality in Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Now, in this novel, the titular protagonist is transfigured from male to female. And what I found in a lot of the critical discourse surrounding this novel is that there was a tendency to only interpret the text from a very sapphic, very feminist lens. Um, this is, of course, indicative of Virginia Woolf's own life. She was known for having sapphic relationships, and she is known as a feminist icon. She very much sparked the second wave of feminism. But this sort of interpretation, this way of dissecting the novel's themes, limits what Virginia Woolf is, I believe, what Virginia Woolf is trying to say. It's a very one note sort of lens that relies on the idea that Virginia Woolf is using androgyny, is using this sort of male identity as a way to escape the burden and discrimination of being a woman in the 1920s. So my thesis statement is: reading Orlando as a non-binary and pansexual protagonist challenges the reader to question the prescriptive nature of modern attitudes regarding sex, gender identity, and sexuality. Before we hop into a textual analysis, I really want to focus on why I chose the terms non-binary and pansexual as opposed to terms like androgyny, bisexual, and lesbianism, homosexuality. So what is non-binary gender identity? Non-binary people identify as neither male nor female. Importantly, you have to consider that non-binary identity isn't situated within the gender binary whatsoever. It's a term derived from the idea of a gender binary, but it doesn't have the tendency to classify certain characteristics as essentially masculine or essentially feminine that other gender identities have. Let's consider the idea that having a mustache is inherently masculine, and it is surrounding this sort of polar vortex where masculinity is. And on the opposite side, directly oppositional, is femininity. Non-binary identity has nothing to do with this model. It is its own thing, and it doesn't really consider any characteristics to be inherently masculine or feminine whatsoever. And that is why I've chosen non-binary as a sort of signifier for Orlando and not androgynous. In the polar model, androgyny is sort of this perfect in between, not only from an anatomical perspective, but also from a psychological perspective. The person that has a balanced male-female mind and a balanced male-female body is considered androgynous. And this just seems very limited. I wanted a term that was an umbrella term that was very fluid and incorporated many different facets of identity. And the idea that you can change your identity, and you can change your identity quite often. For these same reasons, I chose the term pansexuality as opposed to homosexuality and bisexuality. Again, pansexuality is really about being attracted to certain characteristics and not caring about the gender identity of the person that these characteristics manifest themselves in. It's a very fluid idea of sexuality. And in fact, both of these terms kind of interpret the entire idea of human sexuality and the entire idea of human gender identity. All gender identities could be considered non-binary, and all sexualities could be considered pansexuality. But again, it is important to make this distinction when reading this novel because it leads to certain truths. But it would be nice to contextualize these sort of very broad, very theoretical terms to the terminology and to the semiotics that were being used in the 1920s when Woolf was writing this novel. So Orlando was published in 1928, the same year of the famous obscenity trial of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness. This obscenity trial in particular is a very important blip on that the timeline of Western sexuality. This novel was very much written by Radcliffe Hall as a dissident piece of fiction that attempted to take the sexually inverted person, the person that was inherently wronged by society standards, and make them a compassionate and sympathetic figure. The Well of Loneliness takes a very mannish woman. Again, during this time period, gender identity and sexuality are considered linked, inherently linked, as opposed to today where a lot of people take gender identity and sexuality as two disconnected but in the same wheelhouse kind of things. So the sexually inverted woman, the woman who was attracted to other women, was almost considered as appropriating masculine values, if that makes sense. And Radcliffe Hall was very proud of being that sort of static identity, mannish woman, sexually inverted person, and wanted greater acceptance in society for individuals that lived that way. This sort of ideology is very similar to what I call in today's standards the sort of born this way culture, where it's I was born this gender identity and I've stayed this gender identity and I will die this gender identity. It's a very static way of looking at sexuality and gender identity. Also, the backdrop for a lot of theoretical perspectives during this time period is Freud's sexological theories, because he was doing a lot of work with thinking about bisexuality, thinking about same-sex attraction. Freud did consider same-sex attraction to be born of narcissism, as the sort of graph of developing attraction. The person is supposed to grow to love the opposite sex. That is determinative, and it's a very progressive model. And people that are attracted to the same sex as their own, they're stuck in a certain area of that progression. Freud also considered people that were not inherently male or inherently female as a sort of hermaphrodite figure, someone who the sexual distinction is made difficult on an anatomical basis, but the mind could be distinctively male or female. And again, it was considered an abnormality and a non-desirable abnormality. But Virginia Woolf fits very interestingly into this sort of patchwork narrative. The Bloomsbury Group, famous for many notable queer members such as John Maynard Keynes and others, many others, they found The Well of Loneliness to be too polemical. There's this idea that the novel is so inherently political that it forgets to be good. Not that I necessarily agree with it, but Virginia Woolf and other members wrote many statements basically calling the novel bad. According to queer Bloomsbury co-editor Brenda Helt, Woolf opposed both the reduction of desire to sexuality and the concept of sexual identity itself. This is very important to note because it's sort of where we find ourselves at odds today with this idea of non-binary identity and pansexual identity being very fluid and other identities being very static. It's kind of where Radcliffe Hall and Virginia Woolf were situated. Radcliffe Hall believed in this very static identity and advocated for the acceptance of that very static identity, where Virginia Woolf, who was known to have sapphic relationships, had a much more fluid idea of what desire could be and what sexuality was. And it's also very possible that Virginia Woolf had a very fluid identity of what gender identity is. There's this sort of admiration of androgyny in Woolf that can be seen in A Room of One's Own. As she wrote, Coleridge meant perhaps that the androgynous mind is resonant and porous, that it transmits emotion without impediment, that it is naturally creative, incandescent, and undivided. She also wrote in A Room of One's Own, I went on amateurishly to sketch a plan of the soul, that in each of us two powers reside, one male, one female. And in the man's brain, the man predominates the woman, and in the woman's brain, the woman predominates over the man. This concept of a man and a woman residing over the brain, and the great artist being someone who has a balance between those two forces, where sometimes the man predominates over the woman, sometimes the woman predominates over the man, but it's not a petticoat government. It's not this traditional patriarchal construction. It is something that is constantly flipping, and it allows the author to write believable female characters, and it allows the author to write believable male characters. This is kind of what Virginia Woolf believed. It's also important to note that reputed lover of Virginia Woolf, Vita Sackville West, upon whom Orlando is based, would change clothing based on the gender identity that Vita Sackville West believed that she was that day. Vita Sackville West definitely believed that there's this sort of male self and female self in the great artist, and she embodied that through the clothing that she would wear. And Virginia Woolf loved her, so presumably there was some support in that relationship. Finally, we can get into our textual analysis. I would like to start you, as all great novels start, in the beginning. So the very first sentence of Orlando is as such, as is written on the slide. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the fashion of the time did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at the head of a Moor which swang from the rafters. From the very first sentence of the novel, Orlando's sex is in question. There's this idea throughout the novel, but again, right in the first sentence, that fashion and the differing fashions of the time kind of determined sexual attitudes and what was considered essentially masculine. Let's take, for example, the prominence of the heel in male fashion, something that's considered essentially feminine today. If you looked back at different time periods, you would look at the men and think, maybe that's a woman. I don't know what's going on there. Or you would look at the woman and be like, ooh, that's a man, that's a man. And it's very much this idea that shifting societal attitudes are what's determining what's masculine or feminine. Also, while Orlando is still a man, he falls in love with this figure, the figure of Sasha, who, as you can see in the quote, for the loose tunic and trousers of the Russian fashion served to disguise the sex. Sasha isn't necessarily the picture of femininity to Orlando, and yet they exude this extraordinary seductiveness which issues from their whole person. This is just one in a series of lovers for Orlando that has the sort of masculine feminine quality. Orlando thinks later, I love this person. Looking at Sasha, I love this person, and if they're a man, I guess I just have to die alone. There's very much not the sort of hang up on sexuality. There is this comfortable belief I could love these characteristics, even if they're a woman or a man. I love these characteristics, which is very pansexual, a sort of pansexual model of attraction. About halfway through the novel, we get to the transfiguration. And what happens is Sasha breaks Orlando's dear heart, and Orlando falls dramatically into a coma. Quick note, it's very important to realize that this novel is a sort of parody of biography. But within that parody of biography, Woolf is riffing on different eras of English literature and making fun of them. Here we're in a very romantic mood. So Orlando faints and draws into a coma, and there's this sort of fantasy dream sequence. And in this dream sequence, purity, modesty, and chastity come to Orlando's bedside. And they realize something is about to happen. And they say this quote, the first quote on this slide: "Truth, come not from your horrid den, hide deeper, fearful truth, for you flaunt in the brutal gaze of the sun things that were better left unknown and undone. You unveil the shameful, the dark you make clear. Hide, hide, hide." And then truth kind of blares purity, chastity, and modesty away. They're forced to flee, and we are non-binary Orlando, the Orlando transfigured into a woman that still has the characteristics of a man, is unveiled. Orlando had become a woman, there is no denying it, but in every other respect, Orlando remained precisely as he had been. The change of sex, though it altered their very being, did nothing to alter their identity. And let's go ahead and read this other quote. Many people, holding that such a change of sex is against nature, have been at great pains to prove that Orlando has always been a woman, that Orlando is at this moment a man. Let biologists and psychologists determine. And so what's important in these quotes is this idea that psychologically, Orlando the man has not changed whatsoever upon being transfigured into a woman. This is the same person, but in a sort of male-female body. And biologically, while they have gained attributes of being a woman, they still have this sort of male strength. This is a very in-between body. And as you see, Wolf is using the third-person pronoun they to refer to the male-female Orlando. In fact, Wolf only changes to she because of convention, she says later on. So again, we have this person that is not necessarily all the way transfigured into woman, is somewhere in between. But Virginia Woolf does not care to tell us where, and does not. Let the biologists and psychologists determine, figure it out. So we don't have a wholly female person here. We have someone that's in between. Later on in the novel, Woolf says, in every human being, a vacillation between one sex to the other takes place, and often it is only the clothes that keep the male and female likeness, while underneath the sex is the very opposite of what is above. So when first transfigured into a woman, Orlando kind of takes up petticoats, takes up sort of feminine address, acts the woman in the society, but underneath there is the person that's very much thinking, oh, I'm a woman now, I have to act this way. It's a sort of idea that is very prevalent in Butler, that gender identity is very much an act all the way through. It's this constant thinking process that most of us have evolved to just sort of internalize. But however, the transfigured Orlando has to constantly think about it, and is very prevalent in the narrative. But after being a woman for some time, Orlando decides, I could do what I want. I know how to be a man. I know how to be a woman. So I'm just going to do both. And they change clothes and gender depending on the person they're courting. And what's important in this quotation here is that it's not necessarily Orlando changes into woman's clothing to seduce a woman, or Orlando changes in a man's clothing to seduce, or you know what I mean. There's the idea that Orlando is engaging in queer sexuality and in heterosexuality and every possible configuration of gender identity and sexuality. And again, Woolf is very vague. Woolf does not give us the concrete sort of, this is what is happening. It's up to the reader to decide. Near the end of the novel, there's this idea of thousands of selves constantly reconciling within a person, the vacillation of many different people within one person. And with Orlando, these people aren't all the same gender identity. Even all the women aren't the same gender identity. All the men aren't the same gender identity. It's the man and the woman in the brain fighting and reconciling constantly. And again, this is a sort of non-binary way of viewing gender identity. It's very, very fluid. It is changing every second. And these people are constantly at war, but they're also in harmony. Same thing with sexuality. All of Orlando's lovers in the text go between maleness and femaleness. And Orlando is attracted to them despite the vacillation, because they're attracted to the characteristics that they have. In conclusion, within the text of Orlando, we see these two powers split amongst thousands of after images of one person, each have a turn at predominating over the other. In this delightful struggle, the non-binary Orlando triumphs. Although there are those critics who struggle to psychologically or biologically classify Orlando as male or female, it is easiest to simply accept the fluidity of a self unsettled.